Hello there, Boris, Sleepy History here. Tonight, we journey backward through time into a world that most of us have forgotten existed. A world where ancient peoples, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals to help them work, transformed their entire landscape into monuments of earth, clay, and stone. These weren't small hills. They were engineered earthworks, some rising higher than 30 stories, built by hand with baskets of soil carried one by one. They called themselves many names in many languages across thousands of years. But we know them by what they left behind. These mounds, these ceremonial centers, these great gathering places rose across eastern North America for over 5,000 years. The story of the mound builders is not one story, it's many stories, told across centuries, in different voices, in different places. But it all begins with the same impulse, the same human need to gather, to build together, to leave something behind that says, we were here, we mattered, we belong to something larger than ourselves. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into a journey through the rise of these great earthwork societies, one slow footstep at a time. Somewhere around 3,500 years before the modern world, in a place called Watson Brake in Louisiana, a group of people decided to build something that no one had ever built before on this continent. They had no precedent, they had no written instructions. What they had was desire, organization, and the ability to coordinate labor in ways we still don't fully understand. Watson Brake was built by hunter-gatherers, people who hunted and fished and gathered seasonal plants, people who moved through the year following resources, who had not yet adopted agriculture. And yet, around 3,500 BCE, they began constructing. They created 11 earthen mounds, each around 7 or 8 meters high, connected by ridges in an oval arrangement, covering a landscape in a way that required planning, mathematics, and an understanding of how to move earth in massive quantities. This was not a quick project. Building continued at Watson Brake for 500 years, generation after generation, each group inheriting the project from the one before, understanding somehow that this mattered, that this place had significance beyond themselves. And that's what's so remarkable about Watson Brake. It challenges everything we thought we knew about when and why people in North America undertook monumental construction. We used to believe that only agricultural societies could build monuments. We thought you needed surplus food, permanent villages, a class system. But Watson Brake shows us something different. It shows us that the impulse to build, to mark the landscape, to gather in ceremonial spaces, that's something deeper than agriculture. That's something about human nature itself, about the need to create symbols of community, to build something together that lasts. Watson Brake was not alone. In the lower Mississippi Valley, archaeologists have found at least 11 mound complexes from this same early period, suggesting that Watson Brake was part of a broader movement, a cultural phenomenon that spread across regions. These weren't isolated villages building one mound each. They were communities organized in ways that allowed them to undertake massive labor projects, to coordinate across seasons, to maintain knowledge and purpose across generations. Think about what it took to build one of these mounds. A single one, just one, might require thousands of cubic feet of earth. No one person could do it, no single family. It took organization, it took leadership, it took the ability to persuade or command other people to show up and work, together moving dirt from one place to another, shaping the landscape according to a vision that someone held in their mind. The evidence from Watson Brake suggests this happened seasonally, perhaps when the hunters gathered at certain times of year. Perhaps the mounds served ceremonial purposes that justified the labor. Perhaps they marked important gathering places, locations where different groups came together for ritual, for exchange, for renewing social bonds. Whatever the reason, the fact that it happened at all, the fact that it continued for centuries, tells us something profound about these ancient societies. They possessed the social cohesion, the shared purpose, and the organizational capability to undertake projects that would leave marks on the landscape for thousands of years. Then, around 2,500 years later, roughly 1500 BCE, another remarkable ceremonial site emerged further along the Mississippi River, Poverty Point in northeastern Louisiana. If Watson Brake showed us that monumental construction could happen without agriculture, Poverty Point showed us how sophisticated that construction could become. Poverty Point covers more than a square mile. The site contains 6 massive earthwork ridges built in a precise concentric arrangement, like ripples spreading outward in a pond, interrupted by geometric aisles that radiate out like spokes. Nearly 1 million cubic yards of earth were moved to create this pattern. 1 million cubic yards. That's an almost incomprehensible amount of soil carried in baskets, shaped with no machinery, No wheels, no animals, but accomplished through the collective labor of hundreds or thousands of people over many years. What makes Poverty Point even more remarkable is that it wasn't built all at once. It was constructed in phases over centuries, beginning around 1800 BCE and continuing through to around 1200 BCE. This means that communities returned to this site repeatedly, across many generations, and each generation made its own contribution to the complex. Each understood that they were part of something larger, something inherited, something that would be passed on. The geometric precision of Poverty Point's design suggests sophisticated understanding of spatial planning and measurement. The concentric ridges follow mathematical principles. The radial aisles align with geometric accuracy. These weren't random earthworks piled up haphazardly. They were planned according to a cosmological vision, a way of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. Poverty Point likely served ceremonial functions, places where people gathered for ritual, for exchange, for reaffirming their connection to each other and to sacred powers. Moving into the first millennium BCE, we begin to see a shift. The mound-building tradition that had been growing in sophistication across the Mississippi Valley now began to spread into new regions and take on new forms. In the Ohio River Valley, a culture emerged that historians call the Adena, though the Adena people certainly didn't call themselves that. The Adena culture began to flourish around the first millennium BCE, perhaps around 1000 BCE, reaching its peak around the time when the mounds at Poverty Point were still standing. The Adena were hunters and gatherers and fishers. They lived in villages scattered across a wide area, settling temporarily in locations where resources were abundant, then moving on as seasons changed. And yet, like the communities before them, they built burial mounds. Some were small, 20 to 300 feet in diameter, but others reached enormous proportions. The largest known Adena mound is Grave Creek Mound at Moundsville, West Virginia. It measures 900 feet in circumference and reaches a height of 70 feet. Imagine standing at the base of a structure that tall, built entirely of earth, moved one basket at a time, shaped by human hands. It dominates the landscape in a way that immediately communicates importance, permanence, authority. The Adena culture spread across vast territories, including much of present-day Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Pennsylvania and New York. This wasn't a political empire unified under a single ruler. Rather, it was a cultural horizon, a shared set of practices and beliefs that spread across different communities and regions. The Adena people had well-organized societies, as evidenced by the fact that their mound construction required significant labor coordination and sustained effort over generations. They lived in extended family groups of roughly 15 to 20 people. Several extended families formed clans, and between 4 and 6 of these clans made up an Adena social group, a village or local community. Their houses were circular, built with wooden posts and covered with bark and wickerwork, measuring 15 to 45 feet in diameter. These were substantial structures, not temporary shelters. They suggest fairly permanent settlement, at least seasonally, in locations where the community maintained burial grounds and ceremonial centers. The mounds themselves likely served as burial sites, but they were much more than simple graves. They were focal points for ritual activity. They marked sacred places. They probably served as gathering points where ceremonies were conducted, where the dead were honored, where the community affirmed its social bonds and its relationship to ancestors. What's particularly striking about the Adena is evidence of their long-distance trade networks. In the mounds, archaeologists have found materials that came from far away: copper from the western Great Lakes, mica from the Carolinas, shells from the Gulf of Mexico. These weren't casual finds. They were valued objects, often placed with the dead in burials, suggesting they were important to Adena concepts of status and exchange. This evidence shows us that the Adena were not isolated village communities, but active participants in continental-scale exchange systems. They had contacts with distant peoples. They traded. They exchanged ideas and goods. They participated in networks that spanned hundreds of miles. This suggests a level of sophistication and organization beyond what we might initially imagine from a non-agricultural society. The Adena controlled valuable materials. They could coordinate with distant groups. They possessed knowledge and relationships that gave them status and influence, and they used their labor resources to build monuments that reflected that status. Around 200 BCE, roughly 800 years after the Adena tradition had become established, a new cultural horizon emerged in the same region. Historians call it the Hopewell tradition, named after a site in Ohio where distinctive earthworks and artifacts were found. The Hopewell culture represented an evolution and expansion of the burial mound tradition. The sites are more elaborate, the earthworks are more geometric, the trade networks are even more extensive. The Hopewell people, like the Adena before them, were not a unified political state, but rather groups of communities sharing cultural practices, religious beliefs, and artistic styles. What distinguishes the Hopewell from their predecessors is the scale and geometric sophistication of their earthworks. Where Adena mounds tended to be simpler in design, Hopewell sites featured elaborate systems of earthen embankments arranged in geometric patterns. The Newark earthworks in Ohio comprise hundreds of acres of precisely arranged geometric forms, including circles, squares, and octagons, some containing mounds. These weren't built randomly. They were planned according to mathematical principles and, many scholars argue, according to astronomical alignments. The circles align with the rising and setting of celestial bodies. The angles and proportions follow geometric relationships that suggest sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. The geometric sophistication of Hopewell earthworks is genuinely remarkable. Some circles span hundreds of feet in diameter. Some squares contain multiple mounds within their perimeters. The precision of these constructions suggests not just mathematical knowledge, but also surveying techniques, ways of measuring distance and angle without modern instruments. The fact that multiple circles or squares in different locations have comparable proportions suggests shared knowledge, perhaps geometric principles passed between communities or taught at major ceremonial centers. Some researchers have argued that certain alignments encode information about celestial events. The Newark earthworks seem to be oriented in ways that suggest knowledge of the lunar cycle, one of the most complex cycles in he heavens to predict. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests that Hopewell people possessed astronomical knowledge, sophisticated enough to plan monuments according to celestial mechanics. This knowledge would have had religious and practical significance. Religious because it demonstrated connection to cosmic forces. Practical because accurate calendars were essential for agricultural societies. Even though many Hopewell people still relied significantly on hunting and gathering, knowledge of when to plant crops and when to harvest would have been important to communities that supplemented their diet with cultivated plants. The Hopewell tradition probably began in the Illinois Valley, before spreading into Ohio, and then across the Midwest region. As it spread, different communities adapted Hopewell practices to their local environments and traditions, creating regional variations. The Illinois Hopewell sites show certain characteristics. Ohio Hopewell sites show others. In Indiana and other regions, people adopted Hopewell practices while maintaining local traditions. Some regions emphasized certain trade goods more than others. Some areas constructed mounds of different shapes or sizes. The core practices remained consistent: the building of earthwork mounds, the creation of ceremonial gathering places, the emphasis on exotic trade goods and long-distance exchange, the integration of astronomical and mathematical knowledge into the planning of ceremonial landscapes. But the expression of these practices varied from place to place, much like how different religions share core beliefs while maintaining local traditions and interpretations. This regional variation suggests that the Hopewell tradition spread not through conquest or political domination, but through contact and communication, through communities learning from each other and adopting practices they found meaningful. Different communities could experiment with the ideas, adapting them to local circumstances and preferences. This flexibility helped the tradition persist and spread across such a vast area. Over approximately 500 years, the Adena cultural tradition gradually transformed into what we call the Hopewell tradition. This wasn't a conquest. There's no evidence of warfare or violent displacement. Instead, it appears to have been a cultural evolution, with communities adopting new practices, learning new artistic styles, incorporating new spiritual beliefs. Some groups that had practiced Adena burial customs gradually shifted toward Hopewell ceremonial practices. The transformation shows how cultures can change over time without dramatic upheaval, how innovations can spread and be adopted, how people can embrace new ways while maintaining continuity with their past. Both the Adena and Hopewell traditions relied on similar labor mobilization, similar trade networks, and similar ceremonial purposes. But the Hopewell refined and expanded these practices. They built larger earthworks. They organized more extensive trade networks. Incorporated more precise astronomical and mathematical knowledge into their monuments. And they did this not as a sudden rupture from the past, but as a gradual evolution that took centuries to unfold. Looking at the archaeological evidence from Adena and Hopewell sites, we see a picture of sophisticated societies with complex social organization, strong leadership structures, and deep spiritual beliefs. The mounds themselves were likely constructed over several years or even decades, with different portions added at different times. This required sustained commitment, planning across generations, and institutions that could maintain knowledge and purpose across time. Some mounds seem to have been used for single burials of high-status individuals, with elaborate grave goods and evidence of ritual activity surrounding the body. Other mounds contain multiple burials, suggesting they were used repeatedly over long periods as community burial grounds. Still other mounds show no evidence of burial at all, suggesting they served purely ceremonial or ritual purposes. Some may have supported structures on their summits, such as temples or residences of high-status individuals. The variety of forms and purposes suggests that these societies used mounds flexibly, adapting them to different functions as needed. The labor required to build these mounds implies a level of authority and persuasive power. Someone had to organize the work. Someone had to decide what would be built, where and when. Someone had to coordinate hundreds or thousands of workers. The existence of high-status burials with elaborate grave goods suggests that some individuals had greater authority and prestige than others. But the fact that mound building involved the entire community, that everyone participated in the labor, also suggests that these were not tyrannical societies. The mounds were built for communal purposes, for reasons that the community understood and valued. The artifacts placed in these mounds tell stories about the people who built them. Copper ornaments shaped into animals and abstract forms, mica worked into geometric shapes, shells fashioned into elaborate discs and beads, obsidian blades and projectile points. These weren't everyday objects. They were special, valuable, connected to ritual and ceremony. Many show signs of having been used in ceremonies before being buried. Some were deliberately broken or damaged before interment, suggesting ritual destruction as part of ceremonies honoring the dead. The fact that these materials came from distant sources shows that trade routes existed, that communities maintained relationships across vast distances. It shows that exotic and rare materials were highly valued, that they were perhaps more valuable than local materials, and that access to these materials was a way of demonstrating status and wealth. High-status individuals were often buried with more exotic materials than common people, suggesting that control of trade was a source of prestige and authority. Beyond the exotic materials, the mounds themselves contained other artifacts that illuminate daily life. Tools for hunting and fishing, remains of food such as deer, nuts, and seeds. Ceramics, though pottery was not highly developed during this period. These domestic objects, alongside elaborate ceremonial items, suggest communities that balanced everyday subsistence with ceremonial and spiritual activity. The presence of hunting and fishing tools in burials suggests that these were important activities for determining status and identity. The presence of elaborate ornaments and exotic materials suggests that ceremonial roles and ritual expertise were also sources of prestige. Men and women both had important roles in these societies. Women's burials sometimes contain elaborate grave goods, though perhaps not as frequently as men's. This suggests gender hierarchy, with men perhaps holding more formal leadership roles. But women's participation in mound construction and ceremonial activity was clearly significant. The trade networks visible in the archaeological record reveal pathways that would continue to be important for thousands of years. The Mississippi River system provided a natural highway for exchange. The Ohio River connected the Great Lakes region with the Mississippi. The Missouri River opened access to the West. Rivers and their tributaries formed networks of connection that allowed communities to interact, exchange goods, and share ideas. But rivers alone don't explain the distribution of exotic materials. Some materials traveled through complex relay systems, passing from one community to another across hundreds of miles. Others suggest direct contact between distant communities. The Hopewell people seem to have maintained more extensive and systematic trade networks than the Adena. Some scholars argue that Hopewell sites served as trade centers or gathering places where people from different regions met to exchange goods and information. The evidence of intermarriage, the spread of artistic styles, and the distribution of exotic materials all suggest that Hopewell peoples had regular contact with distant communities. What drove this expansion of trade networks? Perhaps it was demand for rare materials that were associated with prestige and ritual importance. Perhaps it was a desire for knowledge and innovation from distant peoples. Perhaps it was the development of more complex political systems that required the acquisition of prestige goods to maintain authority. Whatever the cause, the result was an increasingly interconnected set of communities across Eastern North America and beyond. This interconnection meant that ideas spread more quickly. If one community developed a new mound form or a new artistic style, others could adopt it and adapt it. Religious innovations could spread. Knowledge of new techniques could be exchanged. Trade in exotic goods probably also involved exchange of information, stories, religious teachings, and technical knowledge. Merchants or traders traveling between communities would carry not just physical goods, but also news, ideas, and cultural information. They would see different ways of doing things in different places and bring those ideas back to their own communities. Hopewell earthworks include some of the earliest evidence of astronomical knowledge incorporated into monumental architecture. Some circles and squares seem to be oriented to celestial events. Some scholars argue that the geometric forms encoded astronomical information, that they served as calendars or observatories. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, it's clear that Hopewell people possessed sophisticated understanding of geometry and astronomy, and that they valued this knowledge enough to incorporate it into their largest and most important projects. The effort and resources devoted to creating these geometric earthworks suggests that this knowledge was important enough to justify massive labor investment. Perhaps astronomical knowledge was held by specialist priests or scholars who maintained and taught this information. Perhaps the construction of astronomically aligned earthworks was an expression of religious or spiritual authority. Perhaps the earthworks themselves were teaching devices, places where the movements of celestial bodies could be observed and understood. Whatever the specific purpose, the integration of astronomical and geometric knowledge into monumental architecture marks an important development in these societies, a turning point toward more sophisticated systems of knowledge and specialized learning. The Hopewell tradition persisted for several centuries, roughly from 200 BCE until around 500 CE, making it one of the longest-lasting cultural horizons in North American prehistory. During this long period, communities built hundreds of mounds and elaborate earthwork complexes across the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valley, and beyond. Some sites were clearly more important than others. Major centers like the Hopewell site itself in Ohio seem to have attracted larger gatherings and more elaborate construction. But even smaller sites show careful planning and significant labor investment. The tradition eventually transformed into successor cultures, with some areas maintaining mound-building practices, while others shifted toward different settlement patterns and ceremonial epoch practices. But for many centuries, the Hopewell tradition was the dominant cultural expression in eastern North America, and the earthwork mounds they left behind remain impressive monuments to their achievement. The legacy of the Hopewell tradition extended far beyond the objects and earthworks they created. They established patterns of mound building that would influence cultures for centuries to come. They demonstrated the possibilities of large-scale labor organization and the value of monumental architecture for expressing community identity and religious belief. They created and maintained trade networks that connected distant peoples. They developed specialized crafts and knowledge systems. All of these accomplishments, built on foundations laid by earlier societies like the Adena, set the stage for what would come next. The materials that Hopewell people valued and traded tell us much about what they considered important. Copper, for instance, came from the Great Lakes region, particularly from deposits in Michigan and Wisconsin. Getting copper required either travel to the source or trade relationships with Great Lakes communities. Copper was worked into elaborate ornaments, including breastplates, ear spools, and figurines. These items required considerable skill to produce and were clearly associated with high status. The breastplates, sometimes called coppers, were large, sometimes 2 feet or more across, and decorated with designs that were sometimes incised into the metal or applied as additional ornamental elements. The fact that copper was hammered and shaped suggests metallurgical knowledge and the development of specialized tools and techniques. Making a breastplate or ear spool from raw copper required understanding how to work the metal, how to heat it if necessary, how to shape and decorate it. Some copper items show no evidence of having been used as utilitarian objects. They appear to have been made purely for ceremonial display and burial. This dedication of resources to non-utilitarian objects demonstrates how important these items were to Hopewell religious and social systems. Mica, a shiny mineral that occurs naturally in the Carolinas and other southern regions, was obtained and fashioned into geometric shapes, circular discs, and abstract forms. Mica's shiny quality made it attractive for ceremonial purposes. It catches light and sparkles, making it suitable for ritual ornaments that would be impressive when displayed. Some mica ornaments are cut with extraordinary precision, with perfect geometric forms suggesting careful planning and skilled execution. The fact that mica is relatively fragile, that it breaks if mishandled, suggests that these items were valued not for their utility, but for their beauty and the craftsmanship they displayed. Transporting mica across hundreds of miles from the Carolinas to Ohio or Illinois would have been challenging. Each piece would have to be handled carefully to prevent breakage. The care taken in obtaining, crafting, and transporting mica suggest deep cultural value, perhaps association with light and visibility, with the shining things that catch the eye and command attention. Shells, particularly marine shells from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coast, were shaped into elaborate disc beads and other ornaments. Some burials contain thousands of shell beads, indicating the enormous labor investment required to gather shells, transport them over hundreds of miles, and fashion them into finished ornaments. The presence of such quantities in single burials indicates that shell beads were a form of portable wealth, something that could be accumulated and displayed as a marker of status and achievement. The most common shell bead type is the simple disc bead, made by grinding or cutting a shell into a flat disc shape, and then drilling a hole through the center for stringing. But there were also more elaborate forms: cups made from large shells, pendants shaped from shell pieces. Some ornaments combined shells with other materials, creating composite objects that required multiple artisans working in different media. The fact that many burials contained hundreds or thousands of these beads suggests that accumulating shell beads was an important way to display wealth and status. Obsidian, a volcanic glass from the Rocky Mountains region, appears in Hopewell sites in the form of blades and projectile points. Obsidian is naturally sharp and was highly valued for making cutting implements. Its presence in eastern sites far from its source is particularly remarkable. It must have traveled along trade routes, probably through multiple intermediaries. The fact that it appears in elite burials and ceremonial sites suggests it was more than a utilitarian material. It had ritual significance, perhaps because of its origin in a distant and exotic location, or perhaps because of its association with volcanic activity and geological power. Some obsidian items show no evidence of use as tools. They appear to have been created purely for display and burial, much like copper ornaments. The obsidian sources in the Rocky Mountains are located at least 1,000 miles from the eastern Hopewell sites. Getting obsidian to Ohio or Illinois required passing through many intermediaries, many trade relationships. The presence of Rocky Mountain obsidian in eastern burials is concrete evidence of continental-scale exchange networks. Together, these materials create a picture of a trade system that spanned thousands of miles, connecting peoples from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't a simple market system. It was probably a system of long-distance relationships, perhaps involving formal partnerships between communities, ritual exchanges, and social bonds that linked distant peoples together. The materials themselves were not just goods. They were symbols of connection, reminders of distant relationships, and sources of prestige for individuals who could accumulate and display them. When a Hopewell leader wore a copper breastplate or was buried with shell beads and obsidian points, those objects weren't just personal possessions. They were visible demonstrations of the person's ability to access distant resources, to maintain relationships with distant peoples, to command the respect and cooperation of others. These capabilities were sources of authority and prestige. The crafting of these trade goods shows evidence of specialization. Copperworking, shell bead making, mica cutting, and obsidian tool making all required specialized knowledge and skill. Some individuals or groups probably specialized in one or more of these crafts, producing items for exchange rather than just for their own community use. Evidence of production workshops at Hopewell sites supports this interpretation. Some locations show evidence of large-scale manufacture of shell beads or other items, suggesting that production for exchange was a significant activity. Archaeologists have found locations where hundreds of shells were being worked, where piles of shell refuse indicate ongoing production. The scale of some of these operations suggests that production was organized, that people were allocated to work on shell bead production, but the products were destined for exchange or distribution beyond the local community. This specialization implies a level of economic complexity, with some people producing goods for trade, others controlling exchange networks, and still others providing the labor for construction projects. It suggests that economic relationships were becoming more complex, that acquiring wealth through trade and exchange was becoming an important path to prestige and authority. A skilled craftsperson, who could produce shell beads or work copper into elaborate ornaments, might gain prestige and wealth through their skill. A person who controlled access to distant sources of raw materials, who maintained trade relationships with distant communities, must become a person of considerable influence. The rise of the mound builders. How ancient North American peoples built the great earthworks and ceremonial centers. Part 2. The same thing applies to how these specialists organized their communities. In the Hopewell world, just like the Adena world before it, people lived in villages, that these villages were often located near major earthwork complexes. Some villages might be seasonal, occupied only part of the year when gathered for ceremonies or to work on mound construction. Other villages were probably more permanent, places where people maintained year-round settlements, where they had houses and storage facilities, where they conducted daily life and work. The evidence suggests that Hopewell settlements were often dispersed rather than densely packed. Instead of living in crowded urban centers, Hopewell communities maintained multiple small villages scattered across a landscape, with each village perhaps containing 50 to 200 people. These villages would have been connected by kinship ties, by shared ceremonial practices, and by participation in regional trade networks. Moving between villages, traveling to major ceremonial centers for festivals or gatherings, maintaining relationships with relatives in distant locations, these were probably normal aspects of life. The copper that traveled from the Great Lakes to Hopewell sites in Ohio or Illinois wasn't just raw material. Copper had to be worked and shaped. The Great Lakes region, particularly areas in Michigan and Wisconsin, had deposits of native copper that occurred in relatively pure form but could be cold-hammered and shaped without smelting or complex metallurgical processes. Getting copper from the source would have required either traveling to the source or maintaining trade relationships with peoples from that region. Once obtained, copper had to be worked into final forms. The tools required for working copper included hammers, anvils, and burnishing tools, all simple enough to make from stone or wood. But the knowledge of how to work copper, how to cold hammer it, how to anneal it if heat was used, how to finish and polish the final object, this knowledge had to be learned through apprenticeship or observation. The elaborate copper breastplates, sometimes called coppers, that appear in Hopewell burials represent significant labor investment. Creating a breastplate from raw copper might take weeks of skilled work. The copper had to be selected and inspected. It had to be shaped through repeated hammering, with careful attention paid to maintaining even thickness and avoiding cracks. If decoration was desired, the designs had to be incised or punched into the surface. The back surface might be burnished to a shine. The edges had to be finished smoothly and possibly curled or decorated. The final product would be a sheet of copper weighing several pounds, perhaps 2 feet across, with elaborate designs that demonstrated both the skill of the maker and the status of the owner. Some coppers show evidence of having been worn, their surfaces bearing scratches and dents from use. Others appear never to have been used as clothing, but rather created specifically for burial, indicating that their value lay not in their utilitarian function, but in their symbolic and ceremonial significance. The copperworking tradition that appears in Hopewell sites likely had roots in the Adena period, and possibly earlier. The Great Lakes copper sources had been known and used for thousands of years. But the Hopewell people seem to have expanded the scale of copperworking and the extent of the copper trade. More copper objects appear in Hopewell sites than in earlier sites. Copper workshops where large quantities of copper were being worked have been identified at some Hopewell centers. This suggests that copperworking became more important, more widespread, and more integrated into the broader trade and prestige systems during the Hopewell period. The ability to produce elaborate copper objects gave certain individuals or communities status and influence. If a community or individual controlled access to copper sources, or was known as a source of finished copper objects, that would have been a source of considerable prestige and power. When it came time to build a mound or construct elaborate earthworks, the coordination required would have drawn people from multiple villages together. Perhaps certain seasons were designated as building times. Perhaps when the harvest was in and food was secure, communities gathered to undertake construction projects. Perhaps the mound building itself served social functions, bringing young people from different villages together, allowing marriages to be arranged, allowing status to be displayed and negotiated. The actual construction would have been labor-intensive, but probably not unendurable if enough people participated, and if the work was organized efficiently. If 50 men worked together, and each carried baskets of soil from a nearby source, moving the soil to the mound location, shaping it with wooden implements, the work would proceed steadily. If hundreds participated, if the work was organized into teams, if there was a sense of communal purpose and celebration, the burden on any single individual would be manageable, and the results would be tangible, visible, permanent, something that everyone who participated could point to and say, "I was part of that." The spread of Hopewell practices across such vast areas happened through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Some communities may have had direct contact with established Hopewell centers, learning practices from visiting or from hosting visitors. Some may have had Hopewell people migrate into their territories, settling and intermarrying with local populations, bringing Hopewell practices with them. Some may have learned about Hopewell ways through extensive trade relationships, and as they saw the prestige and benefits that accrued to Hopewell participation, they adopted the practices themselves. The flexibility of Hopewell culture, the fact that it could be adapted to different local environments and integrated with local traditions, made it attractive to distant communities. A community in the Mississippi Valley might practice Hopewell ceremonies and build Hopewell-style mounds, while maintaining local food sources and architectural traditions. A community in the Ohio Valley might adopt Hopewell trade practices and artistic styles, while continuing to hunt and fish in locally appropriate ways. The core practices of Hopewell culture, mound building, trade in exotic materials, ceremonial life centered on earthwork centers, could be adopted without completely transforming local ways of living. The Hopewell tradition seems to have spread across the Midwest and into other regions through a combination of mechanisms. Some communities may have adopted Hopewell practices through direct contact with established Hopewell centers. Some may have learned about these practices through trade relationships, through visiting distant communities, through traveling merchants and specialists who brought not just goods, but also knowledge and ideas. Some may have had Hopewell people migrate into their regions and establish settlements, bringing their traditions with them. The geographic distribution of Hopewell sites suggests a network of connected communities rather than political conquest. There's no strong evidence of warfare or violent domination associated with Hopewell expansion. Instead, it appears that communities found something attractive about Hopewell practices, something that resonated with their own beliefs and needs, something that was worth adopting and adapting to local circumstances. The geometric designs of Hopewell earthworks hold particular fascination for researchers. The precision of the Newark earthworks, with their massive circles and geometric shapes aligned to celestial phenomena, suggests specialized knowledge about astronomy, geometry, and surveying. How did Hopewell people measure distances and angles without modern instruments? How did they ensure that the circles were truly circular, that the angles were accurate? The answers likely involve simple but effective techniques. A rope of known length could be used as a measuring device. A surveyor standing at the center with a marked stake could walk the perimeter, keeping the rope taut, tracing a circle. Multiple people with surveying ropes could work together to maintain accuracy. Sightlines to distant land, marks or celestial bodies could be used to establish straight edges and angles. The builders would have needed to understand geometric principles, but these could be transmitted orally and through demonstration rather than through written mathematics. A skilled surveyor could teach others how to construct circles and straight lines by showing them the techniques, by having them practice, by correcting their work until they achieved the desired accuracy. The alignment of some Hopewell earthworks with celestial events suggests that astronomical observation was incorporated into their religious and ceremonial life. Solstices and equinoxes mark important transitions in the solar year. The summer solstice is the longest day, the moment when the sun reaches its northernmost point in the sky. The winter solstice is the shortest day, when the sun reaches its southernmost point. The equinoxes occur between these extremes, when day and night are of equal length. For agricultural societies, these transitions are important. They mark the time for planting, the time when crops are growing and need attention, the time for harvest, the time of rest. If Hopewell people were tracking these celestial events, observing the sunrise and sunset positions through goat the year, they would be gaining practical knowledge that could guide agricultural activities. But beyond the practical, the celestial cycles also have deep religious significance. The movements of heavenly bodies suggest order, regularity, and the presence of powerful forces beyond human control. Observing these cycles, marking them with monuments and ceremonies, could reinforce spiritual understanding and create connections between human activity and cosmic patterns. The role of women in Hopewell society deserves particular attention. Burials show that women sometimes received elaborate grave goods, suggesting they held important social positions. Some burials contain shells, copper items, and other prestige goods, indicating that women could accumulate and control wealth just as men could. Some burials show evidence of ritual treatment that suggests special status, perhaps religious specialists or leaders. The association of a female deity with agriculture and fertility in what we know of Hopewell religion suggests that women may have held particular authority in ceremonial contexts related to farming and the growth of crops. The evidence is ambiguous in many cases, but it seems clear that Hopewell society was not rigidly patriarchal in structure. Women had economic roles, religious roles, and social roles that gave them status and influence. The exact nature of these roles varied, probably from community to community, and from time period to time period. But the general picture is one of societies where gender roles were more flexible than in many later historical societies. Children's roles in Hopewell communities are harder to trace archaeologically, but we can infer some things from what we know about other pre-industrial societies. Children would have gradually learned adult roles through observation and participation. Young boys might have learned hunting and fishing techniques from fathers and uncles. Young girls might have learned plant processing, craft production, and domestic skills from mothers and aunts. Older children and teenagers might have participated in mound building and other communal labor, learning to work cooperatively, understanding their role in the broader community. The ceremonies and festivals that brought communities together would have been important for all ages, for forming social bonds, for understanding shared beliefs and practices. Coming-of-age ceremonies, if Hopewell society had them, might have marked transitions from childhood to adulthood, testing knowledge and skills, publicly recognizing an individual's new status. The evidence for agriculture in Hopewell societies is mixed. Some Hopewell people certainly cultivated crops, particularly in regions where farming was well established. Remains of corn, beans, and squash have been found at some Hopewell sites. These are crops that could support larger populations and more sedentary settlements. But in many Hopewell regions, hunting and gathering remained important or even primary subsistence activities. This flexibility, the ability to pursue both agriculture and hunting-gathering depending on local circumstances and seasonal availability, may have been one of Hopewell's advantages. Communities could shift strategies seasonally or year to year depending on conditions. In good hunting seasons, they could focus on hunting. In years favorable for crops, they could emphasize farming. This diversified subsistence strategy would have reduced risk and provided more stable food supplies than relying on either strategy alone. The adoption of maize agriculture would eventually transform Hopewell societies and give way to more fully agricultural Mississippian cultures. But in the Hopewell period, many communities still maintained the flexibility of mixed subsistence strategies, not yet committed fully to farming. The houses that Hopewell people lived in show some variation from region to region, but they share common features. Houses were often circular or slightly oval in shape, built with wooden posts set in the ground and covered with bark, thatch, or other materials. These structures provided shelter from weather and created private family spaces. Some houses were quite large, perhaps 20 or more feet in diameter, suggesting they might have housed extended families. Some were smaller, suitable for nuclear families of 5 to 10 people. The arrangement of houses in villages probably reflected kinship relationships, with related families living in nearby proximity. The central areas of villages might have been reserved for communal activities, for storage facilities, for craft production areas. Archaeological evidence of fire pits and tool debris help reveal where different activities took place. The toolkit of Hopewell people shows evidence of specialized crafts and activities. Hunting and fishing implements are abundant, including stone projectile points, hooks, and weights for nets. Clay vessels, though pottery was still not highly developed, show evidence of careful manufacture and firing. Bone and antler tools show skilled carving and shaping. Woodworking tools, including axes and adzes, suggest the construction of houses and other wooden structures. The evidence of workshop areas where certain activities concentrated, shell bead production areas, copper working areas, flint knapping areas, shows that some people specialized in particular crafts. These specialists might have traded their products widely, gaining status and wealth through their skill. The daily routines of Hopewell people would have been structured by seasons and by available resources. In spring, as temperatures warmed and plants began to grow, people would have increased their plant gathering activities, collecting shoots, nuts, and seeds. If agriculture was practiced, spring would be planting time, requiring attention to cleared fields and the work of sowing seeds. Summer would be a time of abundance in many places, with fish spawning, birds nesting, berries ripening. This might be a time when larger groups gathered, when ceremonies could be conducted, when trade and social gatherings occurred. Hunting and fishing would continue, but might be less urgent with abundant plant foods available. Fall would be harvest time, gathering nuts and seeds, hunting animals as they were preparing for winter, fishing as certain species migrated. Winter would be a leaner time, relying on stored foods, hunting larger game, possibly retreating to winter camps in sheltered locations. The technology for food storage was important to survival through lean seasons. Nuts could be dried and stored in baskets in cool locations. Fish could be dried by smoking or salting. Meat could be preserved by smoking. Seeds could be dried and stored in sealed containers. The development of adequate storage would have allowed communities to remain in semi-permanent settlements rather than needing to move constantly in search of food. Some Hopewell communities clearly did have storage facilities, pits and structures where foods could be kept for extended periods. The ability to store food surpluses would have provided security against lean years and would have allowed people to dedicate time to non-subsistence activities like craft production and mound building. A family or community with stored food reserves would have been more secure than one that consumed everything immediately and lived hand to mouth. The processing of plant foods required knowledge of which plants were safe to eat, how to prepare them for consumption, and how to store them. Acorns, which were abundant in eastern woodlands, contained tannins that made them bitter and somewhat toxic until processed. Acorns had to be shelled, ground into flour, and leached to remove the tannins, a process requiring time and knowledge. But processed acorn flour could be stored for long periods and used to make bread or porridge. Nuts of other species also required processing. Many seeds were small and tedious to gather but could be ground into flour or eaten whole. Plants like wild rice, where available, could provide substantial food with relatively modest labor. The knowledge of these plants and their processing would have been transmitted from generation to generation, with mothers teaching daughters, fathers teaching sons, elders sharing their knowledge with younger people. The religious iconography of Hopewell culture, what we can understand from surviving artifacts, suggests a complex cosmology involving multiple spiritual forces and beings. Representations of animals appear frequently in Hopewell art and in objects placed in burials. Birdstones, shaped like birds but of uncertain function, appear at Hopewell sites. Mica cutouts in the shapes of animals are common finds. Clay figurines sometimes represent humans, sometimes animals. The significance of these animals to Hopewell's spiritual beliefs remains open to interpretation, but animals were clearly important. They may have been clan symbols, animal helpers, or spirits in a shamanistic spiritual system, representations of spiritual forces associated with hunting or other activities. The evidence of elaborate burials with grave goods and ritual treatment, suggests beliefs in an afterlife where the dead would need or want material possessions. The evidence of ceremonial offerings in pits and deposits suggests ritual feeding or gift-giving to spiritual powers. The evidence of mass burials and possible human sacrifice suggests that certain occasions called for extraordinary ritual actions, ceremonies that involved death and destruction, as part of spiritual transactions between the human and spiritual worlds. Looking at the broader picture of Hopewell societies, what emerges is a portrait of communities that had developed sophisticated systems of social organization, religious practice, and exchange. They had moved beyond the simpler mound-building traditions of earlier cultures, while maintaining core commitments to monumental construction, ceremonial life, and long-distance trade. They had developed specialized knowledge about astronomy, geometry, and material science. They had created art and craft objects of remarkable beauty and sophistication. They had established trade networks that spanned a continent and allowed rare materials to flow from their sources to distant communities. They had built ceremonial centers that served as gathering places, as visible expressions of community identity, as monuments to shared beliefs and values. And they had done all of this without written language, without wheels, without draft animals, without the technological advantages that would later make empire building easier. The Hopewell tradition would persist for several centuries, but eventually, around 500 CE, it began to decline and transform. The reasons for this change are not fully understood, but various factors may have played a role. Environmental changes, shifts in climate or resources, may have disrupted established patterns. Population movements, migration of peoples into or out of core Hopewell regions, may have fragmented the interconnected network of communities that had characterized the Hopewell sphere. Or perhaps internal developments, changes in religious beliefs, shifts in political structures, emergence of new leaders with different visions, led communities to abandon some Hopewell practices and pursue new directions. What is clear is that by around 500 CE, the distinctive practices associated with Hopewell culture had largely ceased. Mound building would continue in North America, but in new forms and with new meanings. The elaborate geometric earthworks would be abandoned. The wide-ranging trade networks would contract. The specialized crafts and artistic styles would change. The Hopewell world would fade, leaving behind the monuments they had built, monuments that would stand for nearly 2,000 years as evidence of their achievement. But before that transformation, in the centuries of Hopewell's flourishing, something remarkable had occurred on the landscape of eastern North America. Communities that were not yet fully agricultural, that still relied significantly on hunting and gathering, had created some of the largest and most elaborate monumental structures ever built by indigenous peoples in North America. They had organized labor on a vast scale, coordinating the efforts of hundreds or thousands of workers toward shared projects. They had developed and maintained systems of belief and ceremony that connected communities across hundreds of miles. They had demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in solving engineering problems, in creating geometric forms of precision, in producing craft objects of beauty and skill. They had participated in exchange networks that brought exotic materials from distant sources and distributed them across the continent. And they had done all of this not as subjects of an empire or as members of a tightly centralized state, but as members of communities that maintained a degree of autonomy while sharing common cultural practices and beliefs. The rise of the Hopewell tradition represents not just the expansion of mound-building practices, but also a shift toward more complex and interconnected societies. Where earlier mound-building cultures had been more localized and independent, Hopewell peoples created regional networks that allowed for greater exchange of goods, information, and ideas. The tradition spread across vast distances, from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, yet it did not involve conquest or the imposition of a single political system. Instead, it represents the spread of cultural practices that communities found attractive and valuable enough to adopt and adapt to their local circumstances. The trade networks that characterized Hopewell culture suggest not just commercial exchange but also social relationships, kinship ties, marriage alliances, and ritual partnerships that connected distant communities. An individual who controlled trade goods, who could deliver rare materials from distant sources, who had relationships with important people in multiple communities, that person would have had power and prestige far beyond what local authority alone could provide. The hierarchical nature of Hopewell society, what we can understand from burials and settlement patterns, suggests that some individuals had more authority and prestige than others. High-status individuals received more elaborate burials with more grave goods. Their graves were more carefully prepared, sometimes with special structures or markers. Prestigious materials were concentrated in elite burials. This suggests that Hopewell societies had ranking systems, social hierarchies that distinguished leaders from commoners. Some individuals or families had inherited status, passed down through generations. Some individuals might have earned status through personal achievement, through skill in crafts or hunting, through accumulation of trade goods, through spiritual authority. The balance between inherited and achieved status probably varied from community to community, but the general pattern seems to be one of societies with differentiated social ranks. The position of paramount chief, or paramount leader, if it existed, would have rested on a foundation of kinship, ritual authority, control of trade, and personal charisma. A successful leader would have been someone who could organize labor, who could maintain relationships with distant communities, who could resolve disputes, who could organize and conduct ceremonies, who could persuade people to undertake major projects. The leadership probably operated through persuasion and prestige more than through coercive force. A leader whose decisions proved wise would gain followers. A leader whose strategies led to prosperity would attract loyalty. A leader whose conduct of ceremonies appeared to bring spiritual benefit would gain religious authority. Fail to deliver benefits would lose followers and authority. In many pre-industrial societies, leadership remains contingent on continued demonstrated success, rather than residing in a formal office that persists regardless of the leader's abilities. Warfare and conflict in the Hopewell world remain poorly understood. There's little evidence of widespread warfare, like what would emerge in later Mississippian societies. No evidence of defensive palisades or fortifications at Hopewell sites. No epidemic of violent deaths in skeletal remains. This suggests that Hopewell peoples may have experienced lower levels of violence than some other pre-industrial societies. Conflicts certainly existed. Disputes over resources or honor probably occurred, but these may have been resolved through negotiation, compensation or ritual rather than through warfare. The extensive trade networks themselves might have reduced conflict by creating mutual economic interest and kinship ties that made warfare costly. If people from different communities were trading partners, if marriages connected communities, if relatives lived in distant places, then warfare between those communities would be costly to many individuals on both sides. The incentives would favor negotiation over violence. The Hopewell ceremonial sphere extended beyond individual communities and even beyond individual mounds. Some researchers argue that certain major sites served as pilgrimage destinations, places where people from across the region came for major festivals or ceremonial occasions. The largest Hopewell sites, with their elaborate earthwork complexes and evidence of large-scale construction, may have drawn hundreds or thousands of people at certain times of year. Imagine the scene: people traveling from distant villages, arriving at a major ceremonial center over the course of days or weeks. The gathering might coincide with a solstice or equinox, a moment determined by the woodhenges and observatories. Large ceremonies might be conducted, dances performed, feasts held, marriages arranged. Disputes resolved, gift exchanges would occur, reinforcing relationships between communities. Young men might demonstrate prowess through games or contests. Specialists like healers or craft workers might display their skills or teach others. The exchange of goods would happen not just as commerce but as part of ritual gift-giving that created and reinforced social bonds. Prestige items would change hands, moving from communities where they had been made or acquired to distant places where they would be buried with the dead or displayed as markers of status. The calendar of Hopewell peoples, insofar as we can reconstruct it, probably involved coordination with seasonal and celestial cycles. Solstices and equinoxes marked major ceremonial occasions. The lunar cycle, approximately 29.5 days, might have structured weekly or bi-weekly gatherings. Major ceremonies might have coincided with the movements of Venus or other celestial bodies, events that occur at intervals of years or decades. The rituals associated with the agricultural cycle, if farming was important in particular regions, would have been significant. Planting ceremonies in spring, ceremonies to ensure crop growth in summer, harvest ceremonies in fall. The hunting and fishing cycles would have structured other activities. Seasonal movements to hunting camps might have coincided with the migration of deer or the spawning runs of fish. The calendar of obligations and relationships would have been complex, requiring knowledge of multiple cycles and the ability to synchronize them with community activities. The cosmology underlying Hopewell beliefs can be partially reconstructed from the arrangement of earthworks and the placement of symbolic objects. Many earthwork complexes feature paired mounds or paired structures, suggesting duality in cosmological thinking. The alignment of some features with cardinal directions or celestial phenomena suggests that Hopewell people organized their understanding of space and time according to these natural phenomena. The prominence of certain animals in art and symbolism, birds, serpents, bears, and others, suggests these animals held spiritual significance, perhaps as representations of different cosmic forces or spiritual beings. The importance of shells and other marine materials suggests reverence for water and water spirits. The use of mica, reflective and shining, might suggest associations with light and celestial phenomena. The river valleys and waterways that Hopewell peoples inhabited held spiritual as well as practical significance. Rivers provided food through fish and freshwater mussels. They provided transportation routes. They provided water for drinking and for moving heavy loads of earth during mound construction. But rivers might also have been understood as boundaries between worlds, as channels through which spiritual power flowed, as sacred places where the human and spiritual realms intersected. Wetlands, marshes, and swamps might have been understood as liminal spaces, places of transition and spiritual power. High ground and elevated places might have been understood as closer to the sky and the celestial realm. The placement of mounds and ceremonial sites may have reflected these cosmological understandings, with sites positioned at locations that held particular spiritual significance. The knowledge systems that Hopewell peoples developed and maintained represented substantial intellectual achievements. The astronomical knowledge required to align earthworks with solstices, equinoxes, and other celestial events required not just observation, but also the ability to recognize patterns, to predict future events, and to communicate that knowledge to others. How was this knowledge transmitted? Without written language, the transmission had to occur orally, through demonstration, through trained specialists teaching apprentices. Perhaps there were schools or training centers at major Hopewell sites where selected young people learned the esoteric knowledge required to maintain the calendar, to conduct ceremonies, to interpret dreams or portents. Perhaps certain families or lineages maintained this knowledge, fathers passing it to sons, mothers to daughters. Perhaps the knowledge was public, known generally throughout the community, with periodic refreshing of understanding through ceremonies and gatherings at major sites. The fact that Hopewell people maintained this knowledge across centuries and across large geographic areas speaks to the robustness of their transmission systems and the cultural value they placed on this specialized learning. The geometric knowledge required to construct circles and squares of great precision, to align them with accuracy, represented mathematical understanding even without formal mathematics notation. Someone had to understand that a circle maintains constant radius from a center point. Someone had to know how to measure that radius and keep it consistent as the circle was traced. Someone had to know how to construct right angles and parallel lines. This knowledge could be transmitted through practice, through showing someone the techniques and having them practice under supervision until they achieved the desired precision. A skilled surveyor could train others, and the knowledge would persist across generations through apprenticeship and practice. Similarly, the knowledge required to work kof, to produce shell beads in large quantities, to construct wooden houses that were structurally sound, represented accumulated learning that had to be transmitted from skilled practitioners to new generations of learners. In many ways, the Hopewell tradition represents the culmination of the mound-building traditions that had emerged over the preceding 2,000 years. The mound builders of Watson Brake and Poverty Point had shown that monumental construction was possible without agriculture or complex political organization. The Adena culture had developed and refined mound-building practices, creating burial mounds and earthwork centers that expressed community identity and religious belief. The Hopewell tradition built on these foundations, expanding the scale of construction, incorporating more sophisticated geometric and astronomical knowledge, extending trade networks further and wider. But the fundamental purposes remained the same. Mounds and earthworks served as burial places, as ceremonial scent, as gathering places where communities affirmed their identity and relationships. They served as visible expressions of religious belief, places where the human world intersected with the spiritual realm. They represented collective achievement, the accomplishment of groups working together for shared purposes. But before the Hopewell world faded entirely, something else was beginning to emerge in the river valleys and fertile regions of eastern North America. The transformation wasn't sudden. It wasn't the kind of change that happened overnight or across a single generation. Instead, what occurred between roughly 500 and 800 CE was a slow reorientation of how people organized themselves, how they grew their food, how they understood the sacred landscape they inhabited. The old Hopewell ways didn't disappear completely, but they evolved, shifted, adapted to new circumstances, and new understandings of what mattered most. In the centuries after Hopewell's decline, communities experienced a transition period, a time of cultural reorganization and experimentation. The wide-ranging trade networks that had connected Hopewell peoples began to fragment. The geometric earthworks that had been so important to Hopewell's ceremonial life were no longer being constructed with the same precision and scale. But this wasn't a collapse of the mound-building tradition. Instead, it was a transformation. Communities continued to build mounds, continued to gather for ceremonies, continued to maintain connections with distant neighbors, but the form these activities took began to shift. Environmental changes during this transition period may have played a role in the reorientation of mound-building societies. Climate patterns shifted, becoming warmer and more favorable for the cultivation of maize. Rivers and waterways changed their courses, altering the landscape and the availability of resources. Flooding patterns that had been reliable for centuries became less predictable. These environmental shifts would have forced communities to adapt their subsistence strategies, to consider new ways of securing food and managing their lands. A community that had relied on hunting and gathering supplemented by limited farming might find itself in a region that suddenly became more suitable for intensive agriculture. And the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash together, the agricultural package that had been developed in Mesoamerica and was slowly spreading northward, offered the possibility of supporting much larger populations in a smaller area. Maize agriculture, the cultivation of corn, required a different commitment than the kind of supplementary farming that some Hopewell peoples had practiced. Maize didn't grow wild in eastern North America. It had to be deliberately planted, tended, protected from predators and pests, carefully harvested at the right moment. The growing season was fixed. Crops had to be planted in spring and harvested in fall. This meant settlements had to be in place, and people had to remain in their territories through the growing season. You couldn't move around constantly in search of game and plants if you had maize crops depending on your attention. The commitment to place became deeper, the ties to territory more binding. But the rewards were substantial. Maize could produce more calories per unit of labor than hunting and gathering alone. A family could feed itself from a relatively small plot of land with intensive labor concentrated in particular seasons. The rest of the year, after crops were harvested and stored, people had time for other activities. They could craft objects, conduct ceremonies, build monumental structures, engage in trade, and participate in the political and social life of their communities. The transition period saw communities slowly increasing their reliance on agriculture, while maintaining connections to older traditions. Settlements became somewhat more permanent. Villages that might have been occupied seasonally began to show evidence of year-round occupation. Houses became more substantial, built to last through multiple seasons and multiple years. Storage facilities became more important and more elaborate. Surplus food had to be kept safe from spoilage and from theft or damage. The success of the harvest became crucial to community survival, in a way it hadn't been before. A failed crop meant hunger. A successful harvest meant surplus that could be traded, given away to cement relationships, or stored against future need. The management of agricultural surplus and the control of storage became sources of power and prestige. Population began to grow during this transition period as agriculture became more reliable and productive. Larger populations could be supported by the available resources, and larger populations in turn created need for more intensive agriculture to feed everyone. The demographic growth was gradual, not dramatic, but over the course of 2 or 3 centuries, communities grew considerably larger. Settlements that had held a few hundred people in the Hopewell period now held perhaps 1,000 or more. But settlement patterns were still dispersed. Communities didn't yet concentrate into the kind of densely packed urban centers that would emerge later. Instead, they maintained villages separated by open land, with ceremonial centers serving as focal points for gathering and ritual activity. During the transition period, the mound building tradition persisted but in new forms. The elaborate geometric earthworks of the Hopewell period were no longer being constructed. Those kinds of monuments required an enormous investment of labor and a level of regional coordination that had fragmented with the decline of Hopewell networks. Instead, communities built mounds for more local purposes. Burial mounds continued to be used for interring the dead, sometimes with grave goods that indicated social status. But the emphasis shifted. Instead of the massive communal earthworks of Hopewell, what emerged were smaller, more localized monuments. Each community or group of related communities might build mounds, but these were constructed and used within a more limited social sphere. The religious and ceremonial life of these transition period communities seems to have been somewhat less centralized than the Hopewell world. Instead of major ceremonial centers that drew people from vast distances, communities might have had local ceremonial areas where nearby settlements gathered. The knowledge systems that had been maintained by specialists in the Hopewell period may have become more distributed, held by multiple communities rather than concentrated in a few major centers. But the fundamental commitment to mound building and to ceremonial expression in the landscape persisted. Mounds remained important places where the boundary between the human world and the spiritual world could be crossed, places where the dead could rest and be honored, places where ceremonies could be conducted. Long-distance exchange continued during the transition period, though probably at reduced levels compared to the Hopewell heyday. Exotic materials like shell and mica still moved along rivers and overland routes, but perhaps not in the same quantities or with the same frequency. Local production of valued materials became more important. Regions developed specializations, particular areas becoming known for the production of certain goods. A region with good clay deposits might specialize in pottery production. An area near good stone for toolmaking might concentrate on working stone. A community near a river with abundant shells might specialize in shell working and the production of shell ornaments. These specializations would have created reasons for exchange and would have maintained connections between regions, even as the grand Hopewell networks fragmented. The architecture and settlement patterns of the transition period show communities adapting to new circumstances while maintaining continuity with the past. Houses might have been somewhat larger on average, reflecting larger household groups, but they still resembled the houses of Hopewell times. Circular or oval structures with wooden posts and bark or thatch covering. Villages probably had some spatial organization, with houses arranged in clusters that might reflect kinship groups or functional divisions. Ceremonial areas within villages provided spaces for community gathering and ritual activity. Storage facilities became more prominent and more elaborate, reflecting the importance of preserving agricultural surplus. Warfare may have begun to increase during this transition period, though the evidence is ambiguous and varies from region to region. Some archaeological sites show evidence of defensive palisades or other protective structures that weren't common in the Hopewell period. Some skeletal remains bear signs of violence or traumatic injuries. This suggests that conflict between communities, perhaps over access to good agricultural land or control of trade routes, may have been increasing. But widespread endemic warfare, the kind that would characterize some later Mississippian societies, doesn't seem to have been the norm yet. Communities probably still relied on negotiation, gift-giving, and kinship ties to manage relationships, with violence occurring in specific disputes rather than as a constant state of affairs. The subsistence strategy of transition period communities was becoming increasingly oriented toward agriculture, but hunting and gathering remained important supplements. The specific balance probably varied from region to region and from season to season. In regions where maize agriculture was well established, crops might have provided 50 or 60% of the diet, with hunted meat, fish, and gathered plants providing the rest. In regions where agriculture was less established, hunting and gathering might have remained more dominant. The flexibility that had characterized Hopewell's subsistence strategies, the ability to shift emphasis depending on what was available and what was needed, probably remained important. A community that could respond to a poor harvest by increasing hunting and gathering would be more resilient than one entirely dependent on crops. Similarly, the ability to process and store diverse foods would have provided insurance against shortage. The transition period lasted roughly 300 years. During these centuries, communities adapted to changing circumstances, shifted their subsistence strategies, and laid the groundwork for what would come next. The fragmented Hopewell networks gave way to smaller, more localized social units. But the basic traditions, the mound building, the ceremonial life, the artistic expression, persisted and evolved. What emerged was a set of communities still connected to the mound building tradition, but organizing themselves in new ways. Around 800 CE, something remarkable began to happen across much of the Mississippi Valley and into the southeast. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but rather an acceleration of trends that had been developing during the transition period. Agriculture, particularly the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, became increasingly important to community subsistence. Population grew as agricultural productivity supported more people. Settlements became larger and more permanent. The old Hopewell world, which had emphasized dispersed communities connected by ceremonial gathering and exchange networks, gave way to something new. This new pattern, which archaeologists call Mississippian, would come to dominate mound-building societies for the next 500 and more years. The rise of Mississippian cultures across eastern North America between roughly 800 and 1500 CE represents one of the great achievements of pre-Columbian North America. These societies, built on the foundation of intensive maize agriculture, developed unprecedented levels of political complexity, urban sophistication, and monumental achievement. Major ceremonial and political centers emerged, settlements that functioned as true urban places, with thousands of inhabitants, with specialized craftspeople, with administrative structures that coordinated labor and resources on a vast scale. The mound-building tradition, which had persisted for thousands of years, reached its apex in the Mississippian period. The great platform mounds that characterized Mississippian architecture dwarfed the burial mounds of earlier periods. The scale of mound construction, the complexity of ceremonial centers, the integration of astronomical and cosmological knowledge into landscape design, all of these reached new heights. The development of Mississippian culture wasn't uniform across the region. Different areas developed their own variants of Mississippian practices, adapted to local circumstances and traditions. In the Middle Mississippi Valley, centered on what is now Illinois, a particularly sophisticated variant developed, with Cahokia as its premier center. In the Southeast, particularly in what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, other Mississippian centers developed, such as Moundville and Etowah, each with its own characteristics and regional influence. In the Southwest, particularly in what is now Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas, Caddo in Mississippian cultures developed, showing connections to Mississippian patterns while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. These regional variants were not isolated from each other. Trade networks connected them, probably allowing the exchange of goods, ideas, and perhaps people across substantial distances. But each region also maintained local traditions and developed particular solutions to local circumstances. The fundamental change that enabled the rise of Mississippian cultures was the full commitment to maize agriculture. Unlike Hopewell peoples, who supplemented maize with hunting and gathering, Mississippian communities depended on maize as their primary food source. The cultivation of maize was so important that the ceremonial calendar probably centered on agricultural cycles. Ceremonies would have marked planting time, the growing season, and harvest. The success or failure of crops would have been the subject of religious concern and ritual attention. The priests and spiritual leaders of Mississippian communities probably included among their responsibilities the maintenance of relationships with spiritual forces that controlled weather, fertility, and crop success. The shift to maize agriculture had profound implications for how communities organized themselves. Agricultural production required coordination of labor. Fields had to be cleared and prepared. At planting time, many hands would have worked together to put seeds in the ground. During the growing season, crops needed tending and protection. At harvest, the work would have been intensive, with the entire community mobilizing to bring in the crops before weather or pests could damage them. This labor organization would have reinforced social hierarchies. Those who could coordinate labor would have held power. Those who could organize the food storage and distribution would have controlled a valuable resource. Those who could ensure the success of crops through ritual and spiritual authority would have held prestige and influence. The success of agriculture meant that some people didn't have to spend all their time producing food. Specialized craftspeople could dedicate themselves to the production of pottery, stone tools, shell ornaments, or other valued items. Priests and ritual specialists could concentrate on religious knowledge and ceremonial leadership. Political administrators could emerge, people whose primary function was to coordinate labor, manage disputes, and represent the community in dealings with other groups. Warriors might develop as a distinct group, defending community territory or conducting raids on enemies. Merchants or traders might emerge, people who specialized in moving goods between communities and managing exchange relationships. The division of labor became more pronounced, and more important to community function. The growth of population was dramatic during the early Mississippian period, where transition period settlements might have held a few hundred people. Early Mississippian settlements began to hold 1,000 or more. The largest settlements grew into true urban centers. Cahokia, which emerged as a major center during the early Mississippian period and reached its peak around 1200 CE, eventually held between 15,000 and 20,000 people at its height. This was a population density unprecedented in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico. For comparison, Cahokia at its height was comparable in size to London during the same period. Managing a population of this size, organizing labor, ensuring adequate food supplies, maintaining social order, and coordinating ceremonial life, all of this required institutions and structures more complex than anything that had existed before. The emergence of powerful chiefdoms, sometimes called paramount chiefdoms, or early states, marked the social reorganization that accompanied Mississippian development. A chiefdom is a political unit larger than a simple village, with a chief or paramount chief at the top of a social hierarchy. Power flowed from the top downward, with authority concentrated in the hands of the leader and a small group of elite associates. The chief would have had the power to command labor, to organize hunting and warfare, to conduct ceremonies, and to make decisions about community resources. The chief and his close associates would have had access to the best resources, the finest foods, the most elaborate houses. They would have worn distinctive clothing and ornaments that marked their status. They would have received special treatment in death, with burial in important mounds accompanied by valuable grave goods. The nature of chiefly authority in Mississippian societies probably rested on a combination of factors. The chief had to be a skilled leader, someone who could make wise decisions and command respect. The chief had to have religious authority, to be someone who could successfully conduct ceremonies and maintain relationships with the spiritual world. The chief often inherited his position from his father, but only if he was capable of actually fulfilling the role. A chief who made poor decisions, who failed to conduct ceremonies properly, who was unable to organize labor effectively, would eventually lose the support of his people. Some scholars argue that Mississippian chiefdoms rested on a more fragile foundation than we might initially suppose, that the authority of the chief was continued success, and would have been questioned or withdrawn if that success faltered. The control of resources was crucial to chiefly authority. A chief who could distribute valuable goods, who could ensure that his followers had access to prestige items and rare materials, who could organize feasts where people were fed generously, would build loyalty and prestige. The accumulation and distribution of wealth became central to the functioning of chiefdoms. This created incentives for engaging in trade, for controlling access to valuable resources, for organizing the labor that produced valued goods. A chief who could deliver copper, shell, and mica to his followers would cement their loyalty. A chief who could organize elaborate ceremonies would strengthen his position. The rise of Mississippian cultures did not mean the complete abandonment of earlier traditions. The mound-building practice, which had persisted for thousands of years, continued and evolved. Burial in mounds remained important, with elite individuals receiving elaborate burials in prominent mounds. But the Mississippian period also saw the emergence of platform mounds, massive earthworks that served as bases for temples and elite residences. These platform mounds were fundamentally different from the burial mounds that had dominated earlier periods. A platform mound was a flat-topped pyramid of earth, sometimes very large, with a ramp or stairs leading to the summit. On the summit would be constructed a temple or a chief's house, a structure where ceremonies would be conducted, or where chief's house, a structure where ceremonies would be conducted, or where each chief and his family would reside. The platform mound served as a visual representation of the chief's power and elevated status, literally raising the chief's residence above the level of ordinary people. The construction of platform mounds required enormous labor investments. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, the largest known platform mound in pre-Columbian North America, rises more than 100 feet above the surrounding landscape and covers more than 5 hectares at its base. It was constructed in stages, with multiple layers added over time as the mound grew larger. The amount of earth that had to be moved, all carried by hand in baskets, would have required thousands of workers over many years. Such a construction project could only be accomplished by a society with the ability to command enormous amounts of labor, with a compelling reason to undertake such work, and with the organizational structures to coordinate the effort. The very existence of Monk's Mound speaks to the power and sophistication of Cahokian society. Around the base of major platform mounds, and in the open areas surrounding them, Mississippian centers typically had large plazas. These plazas served as gathering places for ceremonies and public gatherings. A plaza might be large enough to hold hundreds or even thousands of people standing together. The plaza would be carefully leveled and maintained, probably swept clean regularly. It would serve as the stage for public ceremonies, for gatherings to watch sporting events or contests, for markets where goods were exchanged, for public announcements and displays of authority. The plaza, with its associated mounds and buildings, would be the heart of the Mississippian settlement, the place where the most important activities happened, the place where the power structure of the society was most visibly demonstrated. Beyond the plaza and the mound groups, Mississippian settlements typically had neighborhoods where ordinary people lived. Houses were arranged in clusters, probably reflecting kinship groups or social units. These neighborhoods would have had their own gathering places, perhaps smaller plazas or open areas where people from the neighborhood came together. The neighborhoods might have specialized in particular crafts or activities. An area near a river might have housed fishermen and their families. An area near clay deposits might have housed potters. Different neighborhoods would have had different functions, but all would have been connected to the central plaza and the mound groups by a network of paths and open areas. The Mississippian emphasis on centralized authority and urban organization is reflected in the careful layout of major centers. Cahokia, for instance, was laid out on a cardinal grid, with streets and pathways oriented to the cardinal directions. The major mound groups were positioned according to this grid. The entire city appears to have been planned, with zones designated for different functions. Some archaeologists have identified what appear to be elite compounds, areas where high-status individuals and their families lived. Other areas appear to have been devoted to craft production, with evidence of pottery making, tool production, and other specialized activities concentrated in particular neighborhoods. Still other areas appear to have been residential neighborhoods where commoners lived. The presence of palisades, wooden walls that surrounded portions of Mississippian centers, indicates that these settlements were concerned with defense. A palisade would have served to protect the most important areas of the settlement and to control access to the center. The construction of palisades suggests that conflict with outsiders, or at least the possibility of conflict, was a concern. Warfare seems to have been more common in Mississippian societies than in Hopewell times. The desire to control trade routes, to expand territory, to defend resources or prestige items, or simply to gain honor through military prowess, probably created pressure for armed conflict. The presence of fortifications suggests that communities felt threatened by potential enemies and wanted to protect their most valuable assets and most important people. Beyond Cahokia, other major Mississippian centers developed across the region, each adapting Mississippian cultural patterns to local circumstances, while maintaining distinctive characteristics. Moundville, located in what is now Alabama, emerged as a major center in the South Appalachian region. Moundville was laid out around a central plaza, with platform mounds arranged in a distinctive pattern. The site includes some 20 mounds arranged in a roughly rectangular configuration around the plaza. Like Cahokia, Moundville shows evidence of careful planning and organization. The positioning of mounds suggests astronomical alignments and cosmological significance. The presence of elaborate burials in certain mounds indicates that the site served important ceremonial and mortuary functions. The vast quantities of exotic materials found in burials at Moundville, shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Appalachians, demonstrate the site's participation in far-reaching trade networks. Etowah, located in what is now Georgia, represents another major Mississippian center with distinctive characteristics. Etowah includes a large platform mound and several smaller mounds arranged around a central plaza. The site shows evidence of occupation for several centuries, with construction and use continuing through the later Mississippian period. Burials at Etowah, particularly in certain high-status graves, contain elaborate copper objects, including breastplates and headdresses that speak to the wealth and status of the buried individuals. The craftsmanship evident in these copper objects indicates the presence of skilled artisans who dedicated themselves to the production of prestige items. The coordination of labor required to maintain these major centers, to conduct ceremonies, to manage trade networks, and to organize regular food production and storage demonstrates the sophistication of Mississippian political organization. The religious life of Mississippian societies was complex and deeply integrated with political authority. The paramount chief often served as the primary religious leader, conducting ceremonies and maintaining relationships with the spiritual world. Major religious ceremonies probably occurred at regular intervals, marked by the agricultural calendar or by astronomical phenomena. The summer solstice and winter solstice, the spring and fall equinoxes, would have marked important ceremonial occasions. Some Mississippian centers included structures that appear to have served astronomical functions, similar to the Woodhenges of Cahokia. These structures would have allowed careful observation and tracking of celestial events, knowledge that could be used to guide agricultural activities and to demonstrate the chief's power over natural and spiritual forces. The cosmology underlying Mississippian religion incorporated beliefs about multiple spiritual realms and multiple categories of spiritual beings. The upper world, associated with the sky and the sun, represented order, light, and positive spiritual forces. The underworld, associated with water, darkness, and mystery, represented chaos, danger, and powerful but unpredictable spiritual forces. The middle world, where humans lived, existed in a state of balance between these opposing forces. Maintaining that balance, ensuring that human activities remained in proper relationship with the spiritual forces, probably fell to the priest chiefs and their spiritual specialists. Ceremonies and rituals would have served to reinforce that balance and to maintain the well-being of the community. A distinctive religious complex. Scholars have identified a set of shared religious themes and practices that appear across multiple Mississippian sites and regions. This has been termed the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, or sometimes the Southeastern Ceremonial Sphere. The complex includes distinctive iconography and symbolic representations that appear on pottery, on copper objects, on shells, and in other media across multiple sites separated by substantial distances. The appearance of these shared symbols and images suggests that Mississippian societies across the region participated in shared religious understandings and ceremonial practices, trade in sacred objects, pilgrimages to important religious centers, and the movement of priests or spiritual leaders between communities may have helped maintain these shared religious practices. The iconography of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex includes distinctive representations of spiritual beings and natural forces. A powerful motif involves a falcon or raptor, depicted in a style that combined human and bird characteristics. This bimorph creature, sometimes called the birdman or falcon warrior, appears frequently in Mississippian art. The prominence of this figure suggests the spiritual importance of birds, particularly raptors, in Mississippian cosmology. Birds, with their ability to fly and to move between the earthly realm and the sky, may have been understood as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. The raptor, powerful and predatory, may have represented warrior prowess, spiritual power, or the chief's connection to the upper world. Another important motif involves serpents, particularly the great serpent or the underwater panther. This creature, depicted as a powerful aquatic being with features of snakes, panthers, or other predators, represented the dangerous and powerful forces of the underworld, particularly the spiritual forces associated with water. The underwater panther appears in different forms across Mississippian sites, sometimes depicted with wings, sometimes with spikes or elaborate decorations. The prominence of this figure suggests that water and water-associated spiritual forces held significant religious significance. Rivers were the sources of water, food, and transportation. They could be beneficial and life-giving, but they could also be dangerous, bringing floods and destruction. The spiritual forces held significant religious significance. Rivers were the sources of water, food, and transportation. They could be beneficial and life-giving, but they could also be dangerous, bringing floods and destruction. The spiritual forces associated with water and with the underworld realm would have been sources of concern and would have required careful ritual attention. A third important motif involves the female principle or fertility symbolism. Female figures appear in Mississippian art and religion, sometimes depicted with symbols associated with agriculture and fertility. Red color was associated with feminine and southern directions, while white or light colors were associated with the upper world and the north. These color symbolisms would have been expressed in ceremonial costumes, in the decoration of objects, and in the organization of ritual space. Understanding and maintaining proper relationships with feminine spiritual forces, with the forces of fertility and agricultural abundance, would have been crucial to community survival. Human sacrifice appears to have been an important religious practice in Mississippian societies, particularly at major ceremonial centers. The evidence comes primarily from burial contexts, where young individuals, often young women, show evidence of having been ritually killed and interred with high-status individuals. The sacrifice of individuals at the death of a paramount chief, with the sacrificed individuals destined to accompany and serve the chief in the afterlife, would have been a way to demonstrate the chief's power and to mark the transition of power to a successor. The ritual killing of captives taken in warfare, or of individuals sacrificed for ceremonial purposes, would have served to express the community's relationship with the spiritual world and to demonstrate the community's power. The architectural expression of religious belief appears clearly in the arrangement and orientation of Mississippian settlements. Major mounds were often aligned with cardinal directions or with celestial phenomena. The plaza served not just as a practical gathering space, but as a sacred space, where the human and divine worlds intersected. The positioning of buildings and mounds reflected cosmological understandings about the organization of the universe. Some scholars argue that major Mississippian settlements were microcosms of the cosmos, with the arrangement of buildings and mounds reflecting beliefs about how the universe was organized. Walking through the settlement, participating in ceremonies at different locations, observing the movements of celestial bodies from specific vantage points, all of these activities would have reinforced religious understandings and integrated individuals into the cosmic order. Ritual practices in Mississippian societies extended beyond the major ceremonies conducted at plaza and mound complexes. Household rituals, conducted within residential compounds or family groups, probably included daily or weekly activities that reinforced religious beliefs and maintained individual and family relationships with spiritual forces. Rites of passage, marking transitions from childhood to adulthood, from unmarried to married status, or from living to deceased status would have been important components of religious life. Purification rituals, conducted before major ceremonies, or to address spiritual pollution, would have been part of religious practice. Divination, the attempt to discern the will of the spiritual forces, or to receive guidance, might have been conducted by specialists trained in the interpretation of signs and omens. The priesthood in Mississippian societies probably included individuals with specialized knowledge of ceremonies, of ritual procedures, of sacred narratives and mythology. Some individuals might have specialized in particular forms of knowledge, such as the healing arts, the interpretation of dreams or omens, or the conduct of specific ceremonies. The training of priests would have been lengthy and demanding, involving the transmission of sacred knowledge, the learning of ritual procedures, and the development of spiritual authority. Young individuals selected for priestly training might have spent years learning under the guidance of established priests. The investment in training priests would have reflected the importance of religious specialists to the functioning of society. The relationship between political authority and religious authority in Mississippian societies seems to have been very close. The paramount chief probably served as the primary religious leader, conducting major ceremonies or overseeing their conduct. The chief's house, often positioned on a prominent platform mound, would have been a sacred space. The chief's body, treated with special respect in death, would have received elaborate burial ritual. The chief's connection to the spiritual world, demonstrated through successful ceremonies and through the accumulation of prestige goods from distant sources, would have reinforced his political authority. A chief who failed in religious duties, who was unable to conduct ceremonies properly or to maintain favorable relationships with spiritual forces, would have been seen as having lost divine favor and would have lost political support. The continuity of Mississippian religious practices across several centuries, despite the rise and fall of particular centers and the movement of populations, suggests deep cultural commitment to these beliefs and practices. Religious structures were resilient, probably because they provided explanations for important phenomena, because they gave meaning to human existence, and because they provided frameworks for understanding and managing relationships with forces and beings beyond human control. The persistence of the mound-building tradition itself, transforming from the burial mounds of earlier periods into the platform mounds of Mississippian times, demonstrates the enduring power of earth mounds as religious and cultural expressions. The relationship between religious authority and political power in these societies was intimate and inseparable. A chief who could not conduct ceremonies or maintain favor with the spiritual world could not hold legitimate power. But the reverse was also true. A chief's religious authority depended on his political ability to command resources. to organize labor, to maintain order and security. The two forms of power reinforced each other in a cycle that could, when things were working properly, create a strong and stable leadership. The paramount chief stood at the apex of a social hierarchy that probably included several tiers of ranked individuals. Below the paramount chief were probably sub-chiefs or nobles who controlled subsidiary settlements or specialized functions. Below them were commoners of varying statuses and occupations. At the bottom of the hierarchy were perhaps slaves or captives taken in warfare, individuals who had no kinship ties to the community and could be compelled to labor at the chief's command. The exact structure probably varied from center to center, and probably changed over time as political circumstances evolved. What was consistent across Mississippian societies was this basic tiered arrangement where power and authority flowed downward from the paramount chief through layers of lesser leaders to the commoners below. The accumulation and distribution of wealth was central to how chiefdom authority functioned. A chief had to be generous. He had to hold feasts where food was distributed lavishly. He had to give gifts to important supporters and allies. He had to provide prestige goods, exotic materials, and fine objects to those who served him. A chief who hoarded resources or failed to distribute them would lose support. The people around him would gradually shift their allegiance to a rival who was more generous, more capable, or more successful. The potlatch-like gift-giving ceremonies common in many North American societies probably had precedence in Mississippian chiefdoms. A chief would demonstrate his power and generosity by giving away enormous quantities of goods. Rivals would host competing steeds trying to outdo each other in the scale of the distribution. The winner wasn't necessarily the one who gave the most goods, but the one who could give so much that rivals couldn't match it, couldn't compete, couldn't retain enough loyalty to challenge his authority. The control of exotic materials became crucial. A chief who had access to copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, or obsidian from the Rocky Mountains could distribute these prestige items to his followers and cement their loyalty. Communities located near sources of valued materials had advantages in these competitions for power. They could control access to resources, demand payment or allegiance in exchange for access, and accumulate the wealth needed to support a large chief court and to undertake massive construction projects. Warfare in Mississippian societies appears to have been more organized and more frequent than in Hopewell times. Archaeological evidence from some sites shows defensive structures like palisades, and in a few cases, evidence of fortification and what appear to be defensive settlements. Skeletal remains from some sites show evidence of violence, including scalping and trophy taking. The taking of captives, particularly young women, was probably part of warfare, with captives sometimes incorporated into the victorious community or sometimes sacrificed in religious ceremonies. Warfare could serve multiple purposes. It could expand territorial control and access to resources. It could demonstrate the war prowess of a chief and enhance his prestige. It could satisfy cultural values around while honor and manly achievement. It could result in the capture of valuable items to be redistributed as prestige goods. The relationship between warfare and chiefly authority was complex. A successful war leader could accumulate prestige and attract followers. A chief who led unsuccessful military campaigns would lose support. The balance of power between competing chiefdoms was probably maintained partly through military deterrence, with larger and more powerful centers discouraging raids or military challenges from smaller neighbors. Trade and alliance probably served to reduce warfare in many cases. Communities that were economically linked, that exchanged goods, that intermarried, that shared religious practices, would have less incentive to wage war against each other. The existence of widespread trade networks and shared cultural practices across Mississippian societies suggests that despite periodic conflicts, there was also significant cooperation and peaceful exchange. During the peak period of Mississippian development, roughly between 1100 and 1300 CE, these societies reached the height of their power and influence. Cahokia, at its maximum extent, covered approximately 6 square miles, included around 120 mounds of varying sizes, and held a population estimated at between 15 and 20,000 people. This made Cahokia one of the largest urban centers in the medieval world, comparable to cities like London or Paris in the same period. The concentration of population in such an urban center required an enormous productive base. The farmland surrounding Cahokia would have been intensively cultivated, with fields of maize, beans, and squash providing the calories needed to feed tens of thousands of people. Storage facilities would have been massive structures, capable of holding surplus grain through the year. The management of these food supplies would have been a central function of Cahokian administration. But Cahokia was not the only major center. The Mississippian world at its peak included multiple powerful regional centers, each dominating a region and maintaining connections with other centers through trade, intermarriage, and shared cultural practices. In what is now Tennessee and Alabama, Moundville emerged as a major center around 1200 CE. At its peak, Moundville included approximately 20 platform mounds arranged around a central plaza, with evidence of a sophisticated administrative and ceremonial structure. The placement of these mounds around the plaza reflected careful planning and knowledge of geometric principles. The largest mound at Moundville, Mound A, rose over 60 feet above the surrounding landscape and would have served as the residence and ceremonial stay. G for the paramount chief. The quality of objects found in high-status burials at Moundville, the careful placement of mounds suggesting astronomical or cosmological alignment, and the scale of construction all indicate that Moundville was a center of significant power and influence. The site shows evidence of being inhabited for several centuries, with construction and renovation occurring repeatedly, suggesting continuity of authority and institutional stability. Etowah, in what is now Georgia, was another major Mississippian center, located in a fertile river valley in the northern Georgia region. Etowah included large platform mounds, with the largest rising over 60 feet high. The site shows evidence of a planned plaza area with multiple mounds arranged around it. Burials at Etowah, particularly in the most prominent mounds, contain elaborate copper objects, including large breastplates, decorated with religious symbols, headdresses, and copper plates with intricate designs. The craftsmanship evident in these objects speaks to the presence of skilled artisans at Etowah and to the wealth available to the Etowah elite. Some of these copper objects show evidence of having been imported from the Great Lakes region or of having been traded widely among past Mississippian centers. The presence of shell ornaments from Gulf Coast sources and other exotic materials indicates that Etowah was integrated into far-reaching trade networks. These and other centers were connected by trade networks, by the movement of priests and ritual specialists, probably by diplomatic visits and gift exchanges. The spread of shared iconography and religious symbolism across these centers suggests that Mississippian leaders recognized a common religious and cultural heritage despite their political independence. The evidence of shared design motifs on pottery, the similarity of religious symbols depicted on copper and shell, and the similarity of settlement patterns across multiple centers all suggest cultural connections and possibly some form of shared identity or religious understanding. Yet each major center maintained its independence and its own local characteristics. Moundville's arrangement of mounds differs somewhat from Cahokia's. Etowah's architectural style shows local distinctiveness. The pottery made at each center shows local variations in technique and design, even while maintaining broader Mississippian characteristics. The regional variants of Mississippian culture represented adaptations to local circumstances, while maintaining connection to broader Mississippian patterns. In the southeast, the South Appalachian Mississippian variant develops distinctive characteristics, while still maintaining the basic patterns of chiefdom organization, platform mounds, plazas, and the complex trade networks. In what is now Louisiana and Mississippi, the Plaquemine Mississippian variant showed influences from both northern Mississippian traditions and indigenous southeastern traditions. In the Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas region, the Caddo and Mississippian cultures developed, showing connections to Mississippian patterns while maintaining their own distinctive characteristics. The fact that multiple regions adopted and adapted Mississippian patterns suggests the appeal of this cultural system. Perhaps the agricultural productivity made possible by intensive maize cultivation made it attractive. Perhaps the religious and cosmological systems were compelling. Perhaps the political structures seemed to offer advantages. Or perhaps some combination of factors led communities across a vast region to adopt elements of the Mississippian pattern, while maintaining their local identities and traditions. The territorial extent of Mississippian influence at its peak was impressive. Mississippian cultures dominated the Mississippi Valley from Minnesota to the Gulf Coast, the Ohio Valley, much of the Tennessee River drainage, and portions of the Southeast. Trade goods from Mississippian centers appear in archaeological sites across a vast region, reaching the Great Lakes to the north, the Atlantic coast to the east, the Rocky Mountains to the west, and deep into the southeast and to the Gulf Coast. The presence of these goods in distant sites indicates that Mississippian influence extended far beyond the core territories where Mississippian cultural practices were fully adopted. Communities in peripheral areas, while maintaining their own cultural traditions, participated in exchange networks with Mississippian centers and were influenced by Mississippian ideas about social organization, religious practices, and material culture. The integration of vast regions into these trade and exchange networks created an interconnected world where ideas, goods, technologies, and people moved across considerable distances. A talented artisan from the Great Lakes might find his way to Cahokia and work on producing copper goods for a Cahokian chief. A priestly specialist trained in Cahokian religious practices might travel to a secondary center to help organize a major ceremony. A young woman married to the chief of a distant settlement would carry knowledge of Mississippian cultural practices, recipes, techniques, and beliefs to her new home. Through these movements of people, through the movement of goods, through the exchange of ideas, Mississippian culture exerted influence far beyond the immediate territories of the major centers. The success of Mississippian societies rested on a combination of factors that worked together to create complex, powerful, and stable societies. The agricultural base, particularly the cultivation of maize, provided the foundation. Maize agriculture could support dense populations and could produce surplus that could be stored and redistributed. But agriculture alone was not sufficient. The religious and cosmological systems provided meaning and coherence to society, ways of understanding the universe and humanity's place in it, and mechanisms for connecting political authority to spiritual forces. The trade networks that connected Mississippian centers and linked them to more distant communities created economic interdependence and opportunities for the accumulation of wealth and prestige. The political structures, the chiefdoms with their hierarchies of authority, provided mechanisms for organizing labor, making decisions, and managing resources on the scale required by large societies. The combination of these elements created societies that could achieve remarkable things. They could undertake the construction of massive earthworks that involved thousands of workers and years of labor. They could maintain elaborate ceremonial systems that required the coordination of large numbers of people. They could maintain trade relationships across vast distances. They could create and sustain urban centers with tens of thousands of inhabitants. The particular genius of Mississippian societies lay in their ability to integrate these various elements into a functioning whole. The platform mounds served simultaneously as residences for chiefs, as ceremonial stages where the chief could display his authority and maintain his relationship with the spiritual world, as burial places for the dead, and as symbols of the permanence and stability of the political order. The plazas served as spaces for gathering, for conducting ceremonies, for hosting markets and assemblies where political decisions could be made and announced. The storage facilities for surplus grain served as visible symbols of the chief's control of resources and his ability to care for his people. The elaborate burials of elites served to reinforce social hierarchy and to commemorate the achievements of the dead. The circulation of prestige goods from distant sources served to demonstrate the chief's connections to the wider Mississippian world and his ability to command access to rare and valuable materials. Every element of Mississippian material culture and social organization served multiple purposes and reinforced the overall structure of society. The infrastructure that supported these societies was sophisticated and extensive. Agricultural fields had to be maintained and improved. Irrigation systems in some areas would have required substantial labor to construct and maintain. Storage facilities had to be built and maintained to preserve surplus crops. Paths and roads connected settlements and ceremonial centers. Some scholars argue for the existence of actual roads in some areas, stretches of land cleared and improved to facilitate movement between centers. Waterways were the primary transportation routes, and Mississippian peoples were accomplished navigators. Canoes, probably made from hollowed logs, could transport goods and people up and down rivers and across lakes. Portages between water systems would have been developed and maintained. The networks of waterways connected the Mississippian world, making long-distance communication and trade efficient and reliable. Settlements were supplied with materials from distant sources. Copper worked into ornamental and ceremonial objects came from the Great Lakes region, often traveling 500 miles or more to reach centers like Cahokia. Shells from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coast moved inland to be worked by specialists into shell gorgets, beads, and other ornamental items. Mica from the Appalachian region was traded widely. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains appears at eastern sites. These movements of materials over vast distances demonstrate that Mississippian societies had the ability to maintain trade relationships across hundreds of miles. Relationships stable enough to sustain regular exchange. The organization of craft production in Mississippian centers reflected social hierarchy and the importance of prestige goods. Pottery was made in villages and homes, but fine pottery for elite use was produced by skilled specialists. Stone carving, bone carving, and shell working were specialized crafts requiring years of training. Copperworking, the creation of elaborate copper ornaments, was a highly valued skill. The finest examples of copperwork, large breastplates and elaborate headdresses, were created for elites and would have taken hundreds of hours of labor. The organization of these crafts probably involved some form of control by elites. A skilled craftsperson might work for a chief, producing prestige items that the chief used or distributed to followers. The control of specialized knowledge and the ability to demand the work of skilled craftspeople became sources of power. A chief who could command the labor of the finest potters, metal workers, and shell workers would have access to the finest prestige goods and would be able to demonstrate his power and status through the quality of the objects he possessed and distributed. The food systems that supported Mississippian societies were based fundamentally on maize agriculture, but they were more complex than simple crop production. The Three Sisters agriculture, the combined cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, provided nutritional completeness and some insurance against crop failure. If corn failed, beans and squash might succeed. The storage of corn in large quantities allowed for the maintenance of food reserves that could feed people during seasons of limited production and could support large gatherings and feasts. But agriculture was supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering. The hunting of deer, elk, and smaller game provided meat. Hunting of waterfowl and the gathering of bird eggs contributed to the diet. Fishing, both in rivers and in artificial fish ponds, provided protein. The gathering of nuts, particularly acorns and hickory nuts, provided calories and fats. The gathering of fruits and other plant foods continued to supplement agricultural production. This diverse subsistence strategy provided resilience. A community that relied entirely on maize would have been vulnerable to crop failure. A community that could supplement agricultural production with hunted meat, fish, and gathered plants was more secure. The distribution of food and the management of food resources was probably a significant function of chiefly authority. The collection of tribute in the form of grain or other food items was probably a way that chiefs accumulated the resources needed to support their households and courts. The storage of grain in community granaries under chiefly control gave the chief the ability to respond to times of scarcity and to call in obligations from those who received his support during difficult times. The hosting of feasts, where large quantities of food were consumed and distributed, was a way for a chief to demonstrate his wealth, his power, and his generosity. The ability to produce surplus grain and to manage its distribution was probably one of the primary sources of chiefly authority. A chief who could ensure that his people had enough to eat, who could provide security against famine, would maintain the loyalty of his followers. The concept of the mound building tradition itself became transformed during the Mississippian period. The burial mounds that had been central to Adena and Hopewell peoples continued to be used, but the platform mounds that became characteristic of Mississippian societies represented a new understanding of what mounds could be and what they meant. A platform mound served multiple functions. It was a visual symbol of power, literally elevating the chief's house above the level of ordinary people's houses. It was a ceremonial stage where important rituals could be conducted before large audiences. It was a defensive position, offering sightlines in all directions and making the chief's residence harder to attack. It was a statement about the permanence and stability of the chief's authority. A community that undertook the enormous labor required to build a platform mound was making a commitment to the chief and to the future of the chiefdom. The construction of successive layers on existing mounds demonstrated continuity, the mound growing over generations as successive chiefs added to the monument. This created a physical record of chiefly succession and the continuity of authority through time. The scale of construction at Mississippian centers tells us something important about labor organization. The construction of Monk's Mound, the largest platform mound at Cahokia, required the movement of an estimated 14 to 20 million cubic feet of earth. This earth had to be transported by hand, carried in baskets from borrow pits to the mound and deposited. Scholars estimate that the construction would have required years of sustained effort, involving hundreds or even thousands of workers. The organization of such a project required planning, the assignment of work tasks, the provision of food and water for workers, the maintenance of motivation and discipline. The chief would have needed administrators capable of coordinating labor, of assigning tasks to different groups, of ensuring that work was done properly. The provision of food and drink for workers on such massive projects would have been substantial. Large quantities of corn, beans, and other foods would have been needed. Beer or other beverages would have been provided. The organization of such provisioning required access to stored surplus, the ability to mobilize resources from agricultural communities under the chief's control, Some scholars argue that certain public works projects might have been carried out during seasons when agricultural labor demands were lower. Planting and harvesting of crops would have been the most labor-intensive times. During other seasons, labor might have been available for public projects. The ability to command such large amounts of labor indicates a social hierarchy where the chief could compel or persuade people to work on his projects, and where people were willing to do so, either because they were compelled, because they benefited from the prestige of being part of such an impressive project, or because they believed in the religious or political importance of the work. The construction of a platform mound was often a multi-generational project. The initial construction of the base mound would have taken considerable time. Then, in later generations, new layers would be added, building the mound higher. Successive chiefs would have added to the monument created by their predecessors, creating a physical record of chiefly succession and the continuity of authority through time. A person who worked on adding layers to a mound constructed by his grandfather or great-grandfather would have participated in this continuity, maintaining the work of the ancestors and preparing the monument for future generations. The existence of multiple competitive centers creates a question about how Mississippian societies maintained stability despite competition for power and prestige. Archaeological evidence doesn't show widespread large-scale warfare between major centers, though some warfare probably did occur. Instead, it seems that Mississippian societies found ways to maintain peaceful relationships while allowing for competitive gift-giving, feasting, and exchange of prestige goods. The shared religious practices and shared cultural symbols suggest that competing centers recognized common interests and common identity despite their political independence. The intermarriage between elite families of different centers, if it occurred, would have created kinship ties that discouraged conflict. The participation of multiple centers and shared trade networks would have created mutual economic interests in maintaining peaceful relationships. The prestige systems that all fur cart owed chiefs to compete through gift-giving, and feasting offered alternatives to warfare for demonstrating power and gaining prestige. A chief could achieve great prestige through organizing impressive feasts, through giving lavish gifts, through displaying great wealth. Military conquest was an alternative means of gaining prestige, but it carried greater risks and costs. Most chiefs probably preferred the competitive prestige systems when possible. The study of ancient mound-building societies through archaeology has a complicated history. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, European American scholars often refused to believe that Native American peoples could have built such impressive monuments. Various theories emerged claiming that the mounds had been built by lost races, by Vikings, by Egyptians, by anyone but the Native Americans who actually built them. These theories were not based on evidence but on racist assumptions about the capabilities of indigenous peoples. The fantastical explanations offered for the mounds included claims that they had been built by the lost tribes of Israel, by survivors from Atlantis, by visitors from Africa or across the ocean. Every explanation was entertained except the actual one. The actual indigenous peoples of the Southeast, when questioned by European colonists, claimed ancestry to the mound builders, stating that their ancestors had built the mounds. But these claims were dismissed by scholars who believed that Native Americans could not have created such impressive structures. Some scholars even suggested that the mounds had been built before Native Americans arrived in North America, or that they were natural geological formations that happened to resemble human-made structures. These deeply mistaken theories reveal the prejudices of the time, the unwillingness to acknowledge the achievements of indigenous peoples. Over the course of the 20th century, as archaeology became more rigorous and as racial attitudes slowly changed, scholars came to accept that the mounds had indeed been built by Native Americans. Archaeological excavations, the analysis of artifacts, the study of settlement patterns, and the application of dating techniques like radiocarbon dating allowed archaeologists to understand not only that Native Americans built the mounds, but to understand something of how they built them, how they used them, and what they meant to the societies that built them. The excavation of elite burials, with their elaborate grave goods, revealed the social hierarchies of mound-building societies. The analysis of pottery and other artifacts allowed the dating of mound construction and revealed connective bonds between different mound-building peoples across vast distances. The study of food remains, of bones and plant seeds, revealed what people ate and how they supported themselves. The application of bioarchaeology, the study of human remains, revealed information about health, disease, nutrition, and the conditions of life in ancient societies. The evidence that allowed archaeologists to understand mound-building societies came from multiple sources. Excavations of mounds revealed the contents, including burials with grave goods that indicated status and social organization. Analysis of the composition and structure of mounds provided information about how they were built and when they were built and rebuilt. The study of pottery styles and other artifacts allowed archaeologists to date sites and to trace connections between different regions. Paleoecological studies, the analysis of ancient plant and animal remains, provided information about diet, environment, and the resources available to ancient peoples. The study of soil and sediments provided information about climate changes and environmental conditions. The mapping of settlements and the analysis of settlement patterns provided information about social organization and the relationships between communities. Oral traditions and historical records, while not always reliable or available for the most ancient mound builders, provided information about more recent peoples and their understandings of their ancestors. The recognition of the sophistication of Mississippian and earlier mound-building societies has grown steadily. Cahokia is now recognized as one of the great urban centers of the medieval world, comparable in size and complexity to contemporary medieval cities in Europe. The Mississippian culture is recognized as one of the most important pre-Columbian cultures of North America. Smaller mound-building centers and earlier cultures like Hopewell and Adena are recognized as having achieved impressive levels of social complexity and monumental construction. The mound builders are recognized as having been sophisticated farmers, skilled craftspeople, organized administrators, and religious thinkers. The networks of exchange that connected Mississippian centers are recognized as spanning vast stances and involving the movement of materials and ideas across most of North America. Ongoing research continues to refine our understanding of these societies. New excavations reveal new information about how these peoples lived, what they ate, how they organized themselves, and what their societies valued. Re-examination of older archaeological collections reveals details that were not understood when the material was originally collected. Modern analytical techniques, including DNA analysis, stable isotope analysis, and computer modeling, allow archaeologists to understand diet, residence patterns, movement of people, and other aspects of ancient life. DNA analysis of skeletal remains can reveal the biological relationships between individuals and can show patterns of residence and marriage. Stable isotope analysis of bones and teeth can reveal what foods people ate. They ate primarily locally grown foods or obtained some of their diet from distant sources, and how nutrition changed over time or differed between social classes. Paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases and health conditions evident in skeletal remains, reveals information about the health of ancient populations, the diseases that affected them, and the physical stresses that people experienced. The application of landscape archaeology, the study of ancient societies through the study of entire landscapes rather than just individual sites, has revealed the interconnectedness of settlements and the ways that ancient peoples organized their relationship with their physical environment. The use of satellite imagery and remote sensing has revealed previously unknown settlements and earthworks hidden beneath vegetation or altered by centuries of erosion and development. The legacy of the mound builders extends far beyond what can be seen in the surviving mounds. The societies that built the great earthworks created systems of governance, trade, and religious practice that shaped the development of their regions. The agricultural innovations that supported large populations continued to be used by later peoples. The religious practices and cosmologies developed by mound-building societies influenced later indigenous peoples. The trade networks and exchange systems created patterns of long-distance contact that would have effects stretching far into the future. The monumental landscapes created by mound builders became embedded in the cultural memory and identities of their descendants, the descendants of Mississippian peoples, surviving through the century. Philippus himself, after the decline of the great centers, would have maintained traditions, stories, and practices connected to their ancestors. The presence of mounds across the landscape would have been a constant reminder of the achievements of the past, of the ancestors who came before. The mound builders, through the construction of massive earthworks, through the development of complex societies, through the maintenance of far-reaching trade networks, and through the creation of sophisticated religious and political systems, demonstrated that pre-Columbian North America was home to civilizations of genuine complexity and achievement. The societies that built Monk's Mound and Moundville, that organized the ceremonial centers of Hopewell and Adena, that maintained exchange networks spanning the continent, deserve to be recognized as having created one of the great achievements of pre-Columbian North America. The mounds themselves, many of which survive into the modern world despite centuries of erosion, modern development, and other challenges, stand as monuments to the skill, determination, and vision of ancient peoples. In the quiet presence of these earthen monuments, we encounter evidence of human ambition, religious devotion, political authority, and community cooperation on a scale that deserves our respect and wonder.